don't sign it. Dad, if that ink touches the paper, you aren't just giving away the house. You're giving him permission to delete me from our history." The words felt heavy. In the sterile air of room 412, hanging between us like a physical barrier. My father's hand was shaking, a fine, rhythmic tremor. It made the gold-plated fountain pen look like a conductor's baton for a tragedy. He didn't look up. He couldn't. His eyes were fixed on a point somewhere 3 inches behind the vellum paper, glazed over with a milky, medicated fog. I've seen this look before, in forensic audits of elder abuse cases. It wasn't the natural fog of age, it was the calculated haze of a chemical straitjacket. I looked past Julian at the head nurse, a woman named Elena, who had been on the Sterling payroll for a decade. She wouldn't meet my gaze. She was obsessively checking the IV drip rate, her fingers trembling against the plastic tubing. In a high-end facility like this, nurses don't tremble unless they're being asked to ignore a protocol that carries a 10-year prison sentence. I realized then, Julian hadn't just hired a doctor, he had bought an entire shift. Standing behind him was my brother, Julian. He was draped in a navy Italian suit. That probably cost more than my first car. His silhouette was sharp, predatory. Against the clinical white light of the hallway, his hand was resting on Dad's shoulder, not as a gesture of love, but as a weight, a physical pressure designed to keep a dying man's hand moving toward a signature. That would trigger an irrevocable transfer of the Sterling trust. The gold cufflinks on his wrists caught the overhead fluorescence, flashing like a warning signal. I had ignored for 6 months. "Ignore her, Dad," Julian said. His voice was like smooth, cold honey, the kind that coats the throat before it chokes you. "You know how she gets. She always loved a scene. She wasn't here when the doctors gave up on the ventilation. She wasn't here when you were calling out my name at 3 a.m. Terrified of the silence. She's an outsider now. Just sign the deed, Dad. We can finally put the estate to rest. You can finally rest." He leaned in closer, his shadow swallowing my father's frail frame. I could see the sweat on my father's temple, the skin looking like parchment paper stretched too thin over bone. To Julian, this wasn't a hospital room, it was a liquidation center, and our father was just a final obstacle to a multi-million-dollar exit strategy. My heart wasn't just beating, it was slamming against my ribs like a prisoner on a cell door. I had exactly 5 seconds before my family's 100-year-old legacy, the shipping lines, the stone mansion, the Sterling name itself, was signed over to a man who viewed our father as nothing more than a failing asset. My mind raced through the numbers I had uncovered. 6 months of total isolation. $15,000 a week in ghost payments to a shell company in Delaware. It all led to this single drop of black ink. I didn't have a lawyer with me. I didn't have a court order or a badge. All I had was a weathered manila folder, clutched in my damp palm, and a secret. I'd pulled from the hospital's digital veins at 3 a.m. I thought of the silent ledger on my USB drive, the proof that the man standing before me wasn't a caregiver, but a captor. "Julian," I whispered, my voice finally finding its edge, sharp, cold, as a scalpel. "I know about the consultant payments. I know exactly what's in that IV bag, currently dripping lorazepam into Dad's system. If you make him sign that paper, I won't just sue you for the inheritance. I will dismantle your entire life, piece by piece, until there is nothing left but the truth." Julian's hand didn't move, but I saw the muscle in his jaw twitch, a microscopic crack in his expensive armor. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just a family dispute. This was a heist, and the prize was my father's soul. To anyone driving past the Sterling estate in Greenwich, we looked like the American dream, carved out of granite. But I didn't grow up in a home. I grew up in a high-security vault. My father Arthur Sterling, built a shipping empire on two things: absolute precision and a total lack of sentimentality. In our house, a hug was a rare dividend. A lecture on compound interest was a bedtime story. I was 22 when I left for Chicago. I didn't leave because I hated the money. I left because I couldn't breathe in the vacuum of my father's expectations. Numbers were my only language, the only things that didn't have hidden motives. If a balance sheet was off by a single cent, I could find it. People, they were a lot harder to audit. They had shadows. When Dad's vascular dementia began to manifest, it started with small glitches, a missed board meeting, a forgotten signature. Julian, ever the golden son, saw those glitches as an opening. While I was in Chicago, finishing a forensic audit for a private equity firm, Julian was at the Greenwich courthouse, filing for a durable power of attorney. By the time I flew back, the locks had been changed, not just the physical locks on the front gates, but the digital locks on my father's life. Julian had invoked the incapacity clause in the Sterling family trust, effectively turning himself into the sole gatekeeper. He fired Mrs. Gavel, the housekeeper who had been with us since I was 6, and replaced the entire staff with specialized medical consultants I had never heard of. I was ghosted by my own blood. I spent 3 weeks living out of a suitcase in an $89 a night motel. On the edge of town, the room smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaner, a violent contrast to the $40 million estate. Sitting 3 miles up the road, I sat on the edge of a sagging bed, my laptop humming on my knees, staring at the distant lights of my own childhood home. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was a predator, trying to find a crack in a fortress. I started with the public filings of Sterling Maritime Logistics. As a minority shareholder, I had the right to request the quarterly ledgers. Julian's lawyers sent them over in a format designed to be unreadable. Thousands of pages of flat file data, with no headers. They thought I'd give up. They didn't realize that to a forensic accountant. Messy data is a confession. I ran the numbers through a Benford's law analysis, a statistical tool that looks at the frequency of digits in a naturally occurring set of numbers. In a real business, the number 1 should appear as the first digit, about 30% of the time. If the numbers are faked, humans tend to overuse 7s and 8s to make them look random. Julian's ledgers were screaming. Every invoice related to facility maintenance and medical logistics was a statistical anomaly. Then, I found the blue wave hole. Between October and February, $4.2 million had been wired from the Sterling Family Trust into a Delaware shell company called Blue Wave Consulting, LLC. Most people see a shell company and stop. I followed the SWIFT codes. Blue Wave wasn't a consulting firm, it was a pass-through. The money stayed in the Delaware account for exactly 48 hours before being wired to a junket operator at the SJM Grand Lisboa in Macau. Julian wasn't just managing the estate, he was bleeding it out to cover a gambling debt. I found a secondary quiet title filing. Julian was trying to reclassify our shipping fleet as distressed assets. It's a legal maneuver to bypass the board of directors and sell the ships at a fire sale price. He wasn't just stealing the house, he was liquidating a century of American industry before our father's heart had even stopped. But the most terrifying discovery wasn't the money. It was the specialty care line item. $15,000 a week was being paid to a Dr. Heiress. I checked the National Provider Identifier database. Nothing. I checked the American Medical Association's registry. Nothing. I spent 4 nights digging through archived medical board disciplinary records. Finally, in a digitized basement of the Ohio State Medical Board. From 2012, I found him. Eris wasn't his name. It was his middle name. His real name was Dr. Benjamin Eris Vance. He had been stripped of his license 10 years ago for unethical pharmaceutical practices in contested probate cases. He was a medical mercenary, a man hired by the elite, to provide the clinical cover needed to facilitate elder abuse. I managed to intercept a digital pharmacy delivery. By posing as a courier, I didn't take the box, but I photographed the manifest. The shipment wasn't for dementia medication or blood pressure pills. It was for bulk quantities of lorazepam and midazolam. My heart went cold as I sat in that motel room, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes. I knew what those drugs were. In the medical world, they call it a synergistic sedation. Midazolam is a powerful amnesiac. You can be awake, you can speak, you can even follow instructions, but you will have zero memory. Of the event 20 minutes later, Julian wasn't just keeping me away from Dad, he was keeping Dad away from reality. He was using a disgraced doctor to create a compliance window every time a lawyer or a notary was scheduled to visit. Dr. Eris would administer a precise dose. He would turn my father, a man of iron will, into a breathing, nodding vegetable just long enough to guide a shaking hand toward a signature line. I looked at the silent ledger I was building. On one side, the gambling debts in Macau. On the other side, the chemical protocol in Greenwich. Julian had built a perfect machine for the destruction of a man's soul. I had exactly 48 hours before the final estate realignment meeting, the one where Julian would take everything. I didn't have a lawyer, I didn't have a court order, I was a pro-SE daughter with a USB drive and a rental car. But I had one thing Julian didn't. I knew the math. And in the end, the math is the only thing that never blinks. I didn't go to the police. In the world of high-stakes probate, suspicions are just expensive rumors. If I walked into a precinct with nothing but my theories. On Benford's Law and Macau wire transfers, Julian's legal team would have me slapped with a restraining order. Before I could finish my statement, they would paint me as the bitter, estranged daughter, a failed auditor from Chicago trying to claw back a fortune she didn't earn. I needed the smoking gun. I needed the digital heartbeat of the crime. It was 2:45 a.m. on a Thursday. The hospital, the Sterling Pavilion, sat on a hill, like a glass and steel fortress. To the public, it was the pinnacle of luxury healthcare. To me, it was a data center where my father's consciousness was being systematically deleted. I sat in my rental car, the engine off, watching the shift change. I was wearing navy Dickies scrubs and a generic ID badge holder. I'd bought at a 24-hour office supply store. I had a stethoscope draped around my neck, not because I knew how to use it, but because it's a universal do not disturb sign in a hospital. If you look tired and you're carrying a clipboard, you are invisible. I entered through the loading docks, following a linen cart. The smell of a hospital at 3 a.m. is a cocktail of industrial bleach, ozone, and a silence so heavy it feels physical. My destination wasn't my father's room. It was the IT server closet for the 400 wing. In modern medicine, doctors don't carry clipboards. Everything is logged in the EMR and dispensed via a Pyxis med station. A Pyxis machine is a computerized pharmacy. It requires a fingerprint scan and a witness for every milligram of a controlled substance. It is the black box of a hospital wing. If Julian was drugging my father, the Pyxis machine was the only witness that couldn't be bribed. I reached the door to the server room. My hand hovered over the handle. As a CPA, my license is my life. Breaking into a medical database is a violation of HIPAA Title II, a federal felony. That carries a permanent blacklisting, and a mandatory prison sentence. If I got caught, I wouldn't just lose my career, I'd lose my name. But then, I thought of the way my father's hand had shaken in room 412. I thought of the chemical straitjacket. Julian was tightening around his brain. I pushed the door open. The server room was freezing, kept at a constant 60 degrees. The blue and amber lights of the racks blinked, like a digital city. I found the primary terminal for the 400 wing. I wasn't hacking, I was using a SQL injection, a technique where you send a specific command to a database that forces it to reveal information. I used a known backdoor in the hospital's legacy software, an administrative override. That hadn't been patched in 3 years. The screen flickered, the database opened. I filtered for patient, Sterling, Arthur, then I saw it, the silent ledger. 11:42 p.m. Access granted. ID, Eris 99, 11:44 p.m. 5 milligrams midazolam, IV push, 11:45 p.m. 10 milligrams lorazepam, IV push. 11:46 p.m. System alert. Potentially fatal synergistic dose. 11:46 p.m. Override confirmed. ID, Eris 99. Note: end-of-life agitation management. My blood ran cold. End-of-life agitation? My father wasn't terminal. He was just inconvenient. Julian wasn't just sedating him, he was redlining his heart. At 80 years old, that combination of benzodiazepines is a slow-motion execution. It creates a state of profound compliance. The patient can nod, sign, and speak, but they have no executive function. They are a puppet, made of flesh. I was about to exit when I saw a secondary log. IoT device sync, room 412. In these high-end suites, the smart system is integrated into the hospital's emergency infrastructure. My father had a HomePod on his bedside table, a gift from Julian, ostensibly so Dad could listen to classical music, but I knew how these devices worked. Under the Privacy and Safety Act, these devices maintain a rolling buffer, a 30-second window of audio that is constantly overwritten. However, if a critical event occurs, a fire alarm, a glass break sensor, or a medical code blue, the device is programmed to save the preceding 5 minutes of audio to the cloud for emergency review. I checked the hospital's maintenance logs. On the night of March 14th, the night Julian claimed Dad had joyfully signed the new trust, there had been a faulty fire alarm trigger in the 400 wing at 11:52 p.m. The alarm had only chirped for 3 seconds, but that was enough. The HomePod in room 412 had triggered an emergency save. I bypassed the encryption using Dad's own Apple ID recovery key, a set of numbers he had taught me to memorize when I was 12. Just in case the world stops making sense. I downloaded the file. I put on my headphones. The audio was scratchy, filtered through the clinical hum of the room. But the voices were unmistakable. Hold the pen, Dad. Just follow the line. I know you're tired, but Sarah is waiting for us to finish this. She said she'll come visit once the papers are signed. Do you want to see Sarah? I can't see the words. Julian, it feels dark. He's drifting. Increase the flow. He needs to stay upright for the notary. Hold his wrist, Julian. Guide the ink. I felt a wave of nausea, so strong I had to lean against the cold metal of the server rack. It wasn't just a theft, it was a kidnapping of the mind. Julian had used me, my absence, my distance, as a weapon to break our father's heart, while the drugs broke his brain. Who's in here? The voice hit me like a physical blow. I snapped the laptop shut and turned. It was a nurse, not Elena, but a younger man I didn't recognize. IT Audit, I said, my voice shaking only slightly. I held up my generic ID. The 400 wing Pyxis is desyncing from the central pharmacy. If we lose the narcotic logs, the chief of medicine is going to have a DEA audit by breakfast. Do you want to be the one to explain why the servers were down? It's the same line I used on the guard, but in a hospital? DEA audit is a magic spell. It induces immediate, compliant fear. Sorry, he mumbled, stepping back. I just saw the lights on. Carry on. I walked out of that server room, my legs feeling like water. I moved through the lobby, past the sleeping families, and the flickering monitors, and out into the cold, rainy night of Greenwich. I sat in my rental car, clutching the USB drive. I had it. I had the silent ledger and the emergency audio. But as a forensic accountant, I knew the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. In American law, evidence obtained illegally, like hacking a medical server, is usually inadmissible in court. Julian's lawyer would have this audio thrown out in 5 minutes. I would be arrested, and Julian would walk away with the $140 million sterling legacy. I didn't just need the evidence. I needed a legal bridge. I needed a way to make the truth discoverable, without admitting I had stolen it. I looked at the house on the hill, the house of shadows. Julian was probably up there now, sipping a 20-year-old scotch, thinking he had won. He thought I was playing by the rules of an auditor. He didn't realize that when you try to delete a man's history, you don't just deal with an accountant, you deal with a daughter. I put the car in gear. I had 24 hours until the probate hearing. I didn't need a lawyer, I needed a strategic leak. I needed to turn Julian's own medical mercenary against him. The hospital was behind me, a digital fortress I'd successfully breached. But as I drove toward the estate, the adrenaline was fading into a cold, sharp clarity. It still looked like a palace. I pulled the rental car into the service entrance of the Sterling estate at 3:15 a.m., moving through the rain-slicked laurels like a ghost in my own life. I needed my bear. But as I stepped through the side door, the midnight and gold warmth of my childhood home was gone. It had been replaced by the cold, sterile scent of industrial citrus. I stood in the foyer and watched, paralyzed, as 2 men in white overalls carried a crate of my mother's crystal out the front door. Julian wasn't just waiting for the hearing. He was already liquidating the assets. I moved toward the grand staircase, but stopped. When I saw the wall of family portraits, my face was gone. There was a pale, rectangular patch of wallpaper where my graduation photo used to hang. Julian was literally scrubbing me from the walls. Before the ink on the deed was even dry, I slipped into the library, my heart hammering against my ribs as I heard Julian's voice approaching. From the hallway, I dove behind the heavy velvet curtains, the dust of 30 years stinging my lungs. I watched through the gap as Julian walked to the mahogany desk, Dad's desk, and tossed a red-stamped envelope into the shredder. I caught a glimpse of the header, SJM Holdings, Macau, final notice. My brother wasn't just a thief. He was a desperate man, drowning in a debt I couldn't even calculate. He picked up his phone, his voice dropping into that smooth, cold honey I'd heard in the hospital. Eris, we're headed to the courthouse now. Give him the 10-milligram booster. I need him conscious enough to nod, but quiet enough to stay in the chair. No mistakes. I waited until the front door slammed and the gravel crunched under his SUV before I sprinted to the attic. I found my bear, tucked behind a false panel, in the cedar chest, the only place the clean team hadn't reached. I clutched the velvet fur to my chest, the USB drive with the silent ledger heavy in my pocket. I had the math, and I had the memory. Now, I just had to survive the next 6 hours, without the law catching up to the daughter who had finally decided to fight dirty. The Fairfield County Superior Court felt less like a place of justice, and more like a mausoleum for the living. Julian sat at the petitioner's table, looking like a prince, awaiting his coronation. Beside him was Marcus Vance, a man whose legal fees could fund a small hospital. Vance didn't argue cases, he dismantled people. He had already filed a trial brief 3 inches thick, designed to bury my standing, before the judge even took the bench. I sat at the opposite table, pro se, alone, no counsel. My bank accounts had been frozen by the estate 3 weeks ago. A classic burn rate tactic used to starve out whistleblowers. I had nothing but a weathered manila folder and a USB drive that felt like a thermal detonator in my pocket. All rise! Judge Silas Miller took the bench. He was 70, with eyes that looked like they'd seen every lie ever told in the state of Connecticut. Before we hear opening statements, Miller began, we have a motion in limine from the defense to exclude all digital records not produced during the discovery phase. Mr. Vance? Vance stood, smooth as oil. Your Honor, the petitioner is attempting trial by ambush. She has submitted logs that have no chain of custody, no forensic verification. They are inadmissible hearsay under Rule 802. They are also highly prejudicial, without being probative of anything, other than her own technical meddling. I stood up. My heart was a drum in my chest, but I remembered the auditor's creed, follow the data, not the emotion. Your Honor, these are business records. Under Federal Rule of Evidence 803, Section 6, they were generated in the regular course of hospital business. I am not ambushing the court. I am responding to the defense's claim that the decedent was lucid. You cannot rule on his state of mind while suppressing the very chemistry that altered it. To exclude this would be to allow the defense to use a shield as a sword. Miller peered over his glasses. I'll reserve my ruling on the logs. Let's see if you can lay the foundation, Ms. Sterling. Call your first witness. I call Nurse Elena Rodriguez to the stand as an adverse witness. Elena walked to the stand, her face the color of parchment. In a real hearing, the gotcha moment doesn't happen in one sentence. It's a slow tightening of the noose. Nurse Rodriguez, I began, pacing the floor. You've been a registered nurse for 12 years. You understand the standard of care for a patient on a ventilator? You know that even a minor dosage error can lead to a sentinel event, a fancy word for a hospital-caused death? Yes, she whispered. And you signed the March 14th deed as a witness, claiming my father, Arthur Sterling, was of sound mind and memory. Those were your words to the notary? He nodded when asked if he knew the document, she said, leaning on her rehearsed script. He nodded? I stopped. Nurse, let's look at the flow sheet from that night. I handed a document to the court clerk. Exhibit C-1. Your Honor, I am showing the witness her own nursing notes. Objection! Relevance? Vance called out. Overruled! It's her own record, Miller snapped. Nurse, at 11:30 p.m., you noted patient lethargic, minimal response to tactile stimuli. Yet, 10 minutes later, you claim he was lucid enough to understand a 40-page restructuring of a global shipping empire? How does a man go from lethargic to titan of industry in 10 minutes without medical intervention? Elena's hands began to shake. He had a moment of clarity. It happens with end-of-life patients. A rally? I mocked gently. Or a chemical shove? Let's talk about the Pyxis med station on the 400 wing. You logged in at 11:44 p.m. You withdrew a cocktail of midazolam and lorazepam. You didn't chart them in the official medication administration record, did you? You bypassed the pharmacy check by using an emergency override. I was following orders, she blurted out. Whose orders? There was no doctor on the floor. Dr. Aris, my brother's consultant, was in the room, wasn't he? He wasn't on the hospital staff. He had no admitting privileges. You allowed a stranger to dictate a synergistic dose to a dying man, and then you accepted a $15,000 wire transfer to a Florida bank account the following morning. Is that your price for a man's soul, Elena? Vance was on his feet, purple with rage. This is scandalous! She is testifying for the witness. Strike it from the record. Your Honor, I said, turning to the bench with a calculated calm. I am moving to introduce the metadata audit of the Pyxis system. I have a certified affidavit from the hospital's IT director, subpoenaed yesterday, confirming that this witness's biometric signature was used to pull those drugs at the exact moment the deed was signed. The moment of clarity was a drug-induced stupor. Judge Miller looked at the sobbing nurse, then at Julian, who was looking at the exit. In a U.S. court, the record is God. The paper trail had become a noose. The logs are admitted, Miller ruled. Mr. Vance, your witness is compromising herself. I suggest you sit down before I hold her in contempt. I have one final piece of evidence, Your Honor, the voice of the grantor. Vance didn't just object. He launched a full-scale legal assault. This is a violation of the Wiretap Act. Connecticut is a two-party consent state. You cannot record a private conversation in a hospital room. This is a felony, Your Honor. If this is played, the petitioner should be arrested. Your Honor, I countered. This wasn't a surreptitious recording by a person. This is a system-generated safety log under the public safety exception and the present sense impression rule. Statements made by a person while perceiving an event are admissible. Furthermore, the hospital's admission agreement, which Julian signed, states that rooms are monitored for patient safety and quality control. He waived his expectation of privacy the moment he stepped into that room to commit a crime. Miller leaned forward. It's a novel argument, Ms. Sterling. But if the device was triggered by the hospital's own safety systems, the fire alarm or a heart rate spike, it falls under the business records umbrella. I'll allow it, not for the truth of the matter asserted, but to show the decedent's mental state and the presence of third parties. I hit play. The courtroom speakers crackled. The audience in the gallery leaned forward, breaths held. The sound of rain, the rhythmic, agonizing wheeze of the ventilator. Then, a sharp, electronic ping, the sound of the smart assistant acknowledging a high decibel event, triggered by a faulty fire sensor in the hallway. Hold the pen. Dad, just follow the line. You're protecting Sarah, remember? You're protecting her. Where is she? Why won't she call? She called, Dad. She said she didn't want the responsibility. She said the shipping lines were a burden. Just sign here, and I'll take the burden, for both of you. He's fighting the sedation. Give him another 2 milligrams of the lorazepam. Now, nurse, hold his wrist steady. We need a clean signature, or the notary won't stamp it. We're losing the window. No, Julian, stop. It's not right. Sarah, Empress. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Julian wasn't a titan anymore. He was a scavenger, caught in the light of a high-intensity lamp. Judge Miller didn't even look at the defense. He looked at the court reporter, his voice trembling with a rare, judicial fury. Let the record reflect that the court finds the testimony of Nurse Rodriguez to be coerced, and the March 14th deed to be a product of extrinsic fraud and undue influence. He turned his gaze to Julian. Mr. Sterling, you didn't just break the law, you violated the sanctity of the deathbed. I am voiding the Sterling Trust and all transfers made under the March 14th instrument. I am also referring this matter to the state's attorney for kidnapping. elder abuse, and first-degree larceny. The gavel didn't just end the session, it felt like it broke the Sterling family line in two. I stood there for a long time as the bailiffs moved in. Julian was being read his rights, his $5,000 suit looking like a prison jumpsuit already. He looked at me then, a look of pure, unadulterated venom. But I didn't feel the sting. I opened my manila folder and looked at the last photo of my father, not the chemical ghost in the hospital, but the man on the deck of the Sterling Empress, looking at the horizon. Justice isn't a flash of lightning. It's a slow, steady audit of the soul. I didn't get a house that day. I got my father back. I walked out of that courthouse and into the rain. But for the first time in 6 months, I didn't feel cold. I felt the weight of the manila folder, the USB drive, and the bear. The truth didn't just set me free. It brought my father home. We spent the next month together as the drugs finally cleared his system. He couldn't remember the details of the theft, but he remembered the bear. He remembered me. The silent ledger isn't a piece of software. It's the record we keep in our hearts of who stayed when the world went dark. It's the proof that even when the powerful try to rewrite history, the truth leaves a trail that even they can't erase. The audit was over. The assets were recovered. But as I walked out into the cold Connecticut rain, I realized that some debts, the ones involving blood and betrayal, can never truly be settled. They can only be archived. My name is Sarah, and this was my father's verdict. If you've ever been the forgotten child, or if you've had to fight your own blood for what's right, tell me your story in the comments. We are a family of survivors, and your voice matters. Don't forget to subscribe for the next verdict.